And this is macroeconomics, chapter 20. We're going to be talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. When you see that word aggregate, don't get nervous. It just means total. We've added it all up. And in this case, for demand, we're adding up total demand of all of our goods and services, not just one product or one service. When we're talking about aggregate supply, we're talking about the total willingness and ability of all of our firms and companies in our country to supply all of our goods and services at different prices. We're not just talking about t-shirt manufacturers or backpack manufacturers. We're talking about all the manufacturers and companies that supply all of our goods and services. So we're thinking big picture, everything added together for the entire nation. All right, we know from talking about the business cycle that our economic activity does fluctuate from year to year. And on that slide that I told you was going to be really important, that mentioned internal, external, and policy factors, at the bottom of that slide, it says the business cycle is caused by changes and shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we will be looking at those graphs. All right, and we've talked about recessions and depressions, and those are the definitions there. Now, even though we mentioned that the business cycle, we don't have patterns of frequency or duration or intensity, we can't make predictions about what exactly is going to happen in the future. We do know that the business cycle is always going to be there, that change is coming, and that when change comes, certain variables change together in certain ways. They might have a positive or negative relation. In this case, we've got a negative relationship with output or GDP. So when we've got a recession, output is falling, unemployment rises. Those two variables move in opposite directions. So even though we don't have a crystal ball and can't tell exactly what's going to happen in the business cycle, we know that certain things are going to happen together. Okay, figure 1, panel A is talking about real GDP, and you can see just levels of GDP throughout the years. Every time we've got a pink panel, you can see that GDP is declining, or we've got a recession. You can see with the green line, with investment spending, now the axes remain the same, so we're talking about the same periods of time. Whenever we hit a recession, investment spending also decreases. But if you compare with that blue line, you can see that investment spending, this is business spending on machinery and equipment, actually decreases even more. The I category of investment spending of GDP is actually the most volatile part of GDP. And then, of course, when we hit a recession, you can see that the unemployment rate jumps up when we hit periods of economic decline. Okay, so if we know that certain variables are going to change together, we can use a model to explain some short-run fluctuations in our economy. In this chapter, we're only going to be covering the short-run graph. So don't worry about the long-run aggregate supply graph. We're just going to be talking about the short-run aggregate supply graph. All right, here's the definition of aggregate demand. The quantity, how many goods and services that all of these entities in our country want to buy, are able and willing to buy at every single price. Let me switch over here to the document viewing. You'll recall that for let's talk about regular demand before we talk about aggregate demand. We were talking about the price and quantity of one product. Okay, if this was Coke, we're going to need a separate graph, completely separate graph for Pepsi. Or if this was peanut butter, we need a completely different graph for jelly. Remember, each graph gets its own price and quantity for each item, for each good or service that we have. Now, for aggregate demand, you'll notice on the slide it said downward sloping, so it has the same shape, but now, remember I told you aggregate means total, we've added everything up. So this isn't just the demand for Coke anymore, it's the demand for all of our food and clothing everything that our households, firms, the government, and customers abroad want to buy. All of our goods and services added together. So it's not just the quantity of one item anymore that goes over here on the horizontal axis. It's real GDP. Remember, this is our output. This is our measure of all the goods and services that we produce within our nation's borders. Remember, aggregate, we're thinking of total now. Not just the quantity of one item, we're talking about the goods, all the goods and services that we've made. Adjusted for inflation, that's real GDP. Okay, instead of the price of one item over here, you think about our measure for the overall price level. When we were constructing our measure of, how do we measure inflation, we were building the basket costs when we were using the consumer price index formula. And you'll remember that in our basket, it includes housing, food, shoes, gas, toilet paper, toiletries, all the medical, all the stuff that a normal household would need to buy. And so you can put the CPI over here, which stands for the Consumer Price Index, for the overall price level, because we're talking about a bunch of goods and services now, not just one. Aggregate supply, here's the definition of it. We're talking about, like I said, all of our suppliers now, all of our companies. It is upward sloping just like supply was, but it's got those two new labels on the horizontal and vertical axis, real GDP and CPI, instead of quantity and price now. And we can put them together to use a model just like you did with regular supply and regular demand. Okay, now when your author says price level over here on the vertical axis, they mean the overall price level. CPI is fine for me if you were to draw this out and label it on a exam or quiz. Quantity of output, remember output's just another word for the goods and services that we produce, GDP, so that's fine. Okay, this slide just talks about why the aggregate demand curve is sloping downward, and I'll just focus on the first one. As the price level, overall price level goes down, our money goes further, the purchasing power of our money is greater, and so that's what we call the wealth effect. Interest rates and when our currency depreciates, those also play a role in why it's sloping downward, but we're actually going to talk about interest rates in another chapter. Just know that it has the same shape as regular demand for right now, and that it can move around like our regular demand curve too. So if people decide to consume more, they're really optimistic about the future, maybe they've just had a tax rebate mailed to them and they go deposit that check. If they decide to spend more on a bunch of different goods and services, that'll shift aggregate demand to the right. If businesses decide to buy more machinery and equipment, maybe there's a capital gains tax. They don't have to pay as much capital gains tax as they did before. That can shift aggregate demand to the right. Our government deciding to build new roads, they're going to have to buy the materials and hire the labor, and all of that government spending can actually impact aggregate demand also. An increase in the level of net exports, so other countries buying more of our stuff than we're buying of their stuff, can shift aggregate demand to the right too. And all of this stuff should sound really familiar. Net exports, government spending, investment, consumption, all of that makes up GDP. And that makes sense because GDP is right here on the horizontal axis. When this shifts out to the right, we'll see that at our equilibrium point, real GDP is going to increase also. You can abbreviate AD and AS, that's okay. Okay, aggregate supply slopes upward in the short run. Remember, we're just going to focus on the short run aggregate supply curve in this class. For these reasons, it slopes upward like we're used to. Aggregate supply can shift to the left and right also. So if there's better technology and businesses decide to produce more goods and services, that can shift aggregate supply out to the right. If there's more labor, if we've, for example, have a lot of immigration, a lot of people who are willing to work, that can shift aggregate supply to the right. If there's a discovery of natural resources and minerals in the ground, then that could, or oil, that would shift aggregate supply to the right. If we have more taxes, then that might shift aggregate supply to the left, or taxes for businesses. So when you put these two together, we can make predictions about the CPI and real GDP. So let's take a look at an example. A wave of pessimism, a massive wave of pessimism. If people are really scared about the future, not optimistic at all, they're really pessimistic about future incomes, they don't know if they're going to get laid off or not, they're going to be holding off on a lot of purchases. So not a lot of vacations, and we're not going to be buying our new refrigerator, we're just going to make do with what we have. And if a lot of people start doing that, aggregate demand can shift to the left. So let's come back over here. When we were first graphing regular supply and demand graphs, so it's going to be really, really important that you label everything correctly. Same thing here. And this is aggregate supply. Here's aggregate demand. We're not just talking about one product anymore, but everything added up together. Real GDP, CPI over here. All right, a wave of consumer pessimism has occurred. Now, let me do our first equilibrium before anything has happened. Now, if people are really, really scared about the future, not buying as much, that's going to be my new aggregate demand curve. I'll call that 2, and I'll call our original 1. Aggregate demand 1. There's our second equilibrium. Okay, well, you can see our first level, GDP is right there, and if this is 0, and if this is 100 out here. And here is our second level of GDP. And you can see that we've gotten closer to 0, right? So GDP is actually declined, and we have a word for that, recession. When output declines from one period to the next. Here's our first price level. Here's our second price level. And you can see that this is also decline. Okay, and that would be deflation. Although in real life, economists say that prices and wages are, we call them sticky. It's going to take a lot of pressure for businesses to actually revise their menus to reflect lower prices. For employees, it's going to take a lot of pressure. Things have to get really, really bad for us to accept pay cuts. And so in theory, we'll see, we would see downward pressure on prices. But in real life, things would have to get really, really bad before this actually decreases. So going back to our slide, in the short run, we'll see that GDP is going to fall and the price level will fall. And that's just a graphical representation of what actually happened with the Great Depression. You can see with these numbers how bad it was. So a lot of consumer wealth was, had declined. So less consumer spending, less investment spending, definitely. So it caused a decrease in aggregate demand. Well, what reversed that? What caused aggregate demand to shift back out to the right? Well, in this case, it was our spending on World War II. Not that going to war is a solution for when a country is in a recession. It's just what happened in this case, that the government did have to spend a lot of money on the military, and that increased aggregate demand. Okay, let's take a look at another example. If aggregate supply shifts to the left, let's come back over here to the document camera. Let me set everything back up here. I'm just going to abbreviate this time with aggregate supply, aggregate demand. You'll remember on the horizontal axis, that's real GDP. On the vertical axis, that is the consumer price index. Here's our first equilibrium. All right, and the example said aggregate supply shifting to the left. That can be caused by an oil shock or a crop failure. Now, what are we saying here when aggregate supply shifting to the left? All of our suppliers, our businesses and firms are, for some reason, willing and able to produce fewer goods and services now at every price level. So something bad has happened. So like OPEC tripling gas prices or terrible crop failure, all of the corn in the Midwest, that crop is just wiped out. So something bad has had to have happened for our producers to make fewer stuff. Okay, so here's our second equilibrium. Let's see what happens to GDP. This is our original GDP. This is 0, this is 100 over here. Here's our new level of GDP. You can see that we've gotten closer to 0. So real GDP has declined, and we already know that our word for that is a recession. Okay, here's our original price level. Here's our new price level. You see that it's gone up. Well, what do we call the overall price level increasing? Inflation. Okay, when we had aggregate demand shifting to the left, that was bad enough with a recession. Now we've got two bad things happening at the same time. And the word for that is, I've got it over here on the slide, stagflation. And that's when we have high unemployment and caused by a recession and inflation happening at the same time. And it's really hard because now our policymakers have to think about which one do we fight first. Do we fight the unemployment or do we fight inflation? And, in the past, our Federal Reserve and economists have said we need to fight unemployment first and try to help out the economy, stimulate it, and get it back on its feet. Then we can deal with the problem of rising prices if that occurs. One more thing I need to show you. Let me come back to our document camera. When we have inflation caused from the supply side, from aggregate supply shifting to the left, the word for this is cost push inflation. This was mentioned at the end of chapter 11, but now you can see graphically what it's talking about. There's another type of inflation. Let me set this up. And it's caused from the demand side. So this is from aggregate supply shifting to the left. Now, what is the only way that aggregate demand can shift, which is the only way it can shift to cause inflation? To the right. So that's aggregate demand 2, equilibrium 2. That was 1, and that was equilibrium 1. Okay, here's GDP before. You can see that GDP has increased. That's a good thing. That's what we want with economic growth. But what's happened with prices? That was the original price level. Now, you can see that inflation has occurred. When inflation is caused from the demand side, that's called demand pull inflation. Again, this can be from a lot of people, population growth. It can be from overly optimistic people. Incomes have risen. People are just really, really thinking favorably about the future, that they're going to have increased incomes, and so they're going to be buying more clothing, houses, cars, and things like that. And also you can see from this graph why our goal of economic growth is just 3 and not 10. There's going to be some level of prices increasing, but we just don't want it to be too much when our economy is growing in this way from the demand side. So make sure you're able to describe in words and sentences what cost push and demand pull inflation are, and be able to recognize them and draw them on graphs. Okay, and that is chapter 20.